Welcome to the latest installment of Re-Examining the Rod. We have a lot to talk about today. Actually, this conversation is a conversation that I just want to start because I don't know if I fully feel comfortable being a part of it. Remember, during Re-Examining the Rod, we are looking at a conversation between Dr. Stacey Patton and Touré on the Touré Show on the podcast. And we are asking questions about a statement that she made. Is spanking black children the whitest thing that black parents can do? That's what we're talking about. So what I want to do is I want us to jump right into the interview. And I want us to talk about this hard topic today. This is what our session is going to be about today. Here's the question. Are black women and maternal violence the reason for misogynistic, abusive, and wounded men? Well, Dr. Stacey Patton seems to think that, and you'll see why I say that coming up in this clip. Stay tuned for the next episode of Re-Examining the Rod. Well, you heard the question in the intro, and I'll ask it one more time. This is what we're talking about today on the latest installment of Re-Examining the Rod. Are black women and maternal violence the reason for misogynistic, abusive, and wounded men? Are black women and maternal violence the reason we have misogynistic, abusive, and wounded men? Dr. Stacey Patton seems to think that that plays a big part of the reason, and I want you to hear her out, and then let's talk about this.
Relationships, and also when you were talking about your mother's role, right? She may not have hit you, but she was complicit in the betrayal and in the violence. So I get into a lot of trouble, particularly with feminist scholars over this. They like to look at male violence and men's attitudes about women and say it's all patriarchy. And I'm not dismissing patriarchy. I'm not dismissing structural racism. But if you really want to understand how some men relate to women in terms of their attitudes and behaviors, you have to go back to their earliest childhood experiences with their mothers. And when we look at the data, particularly in black communities on child abuse, the data tells us that the majority of the abuse and the fatalities are perpetuated by women. And so if you want to figure out why a man is a misogynist, you've got to go back to those early childhood experiences. And people don't want to have that conversation because then we have to talk about maternal violence and women's complicity in creating the very men who hate us.
I think this is a big conversation. And I really appreciate the boldness of Dr. Stacey Patton to bring this conversation out. I think there's a particular kind of courage and boldness whenever individuals have to call their side of the sexual spectrum out for a societal problem that exists instead of allowing everyone to point fingers across the aisle. And I think what happens a lot, many times is that black men are pointing fingers at black women and black women are pointing fingers back at black men. But what we need for real accountability is we need black men pointing fingers at black men and then black women pointing fingers at black women, holding one another accountable, and then we both come to the center to hold each other accountable. So I believe there's only a part of this conversation that I can have because I believe that this conversation cannot be hijacked by black men, but has to be progressed, has to be taken over, and has to be led by black women. Here is what I will say. Throughout my time working with black young men, black boys, and black older men, when it comes to abuse, I have heard more stories of young men being wounded by the abuse of their single mothers. And I've heard more stories about young men being wounded by the absence of their fathers. And so when we talk about this, this doesn't mean that we are letting fathers off the hook. But this does mean that we have to begin to start to ask different questions. One of the questions that, or one of the statistics that Dr. Stacy put forward is that most of the violence that is reported and the violence that leads to death against black boys takes place by black women. And one of the questions I have is why? And undoubtedly, when you hear stories, when you think about stories, when you hear stories or you think about the stories that you've heard, or when you are have the chance to peek into someone's life, especially a black woman, a younger black woman or older black woman, I believe that maybe there is a link between black women abusing black boys and raising wounded, misogynistic and abusive black men because the little girl in them was abused by a black man itself. Or the little girl in them made a big decision to lay down with a black man and the black man wasn't there. Or the little girl in them sought affirmation from the black men who were supposed to give it to them. And now whenever they encounter the black male species, there's a sometimes intentional, sometimes unintentional, sometimes evident, sometimes hidden anger and resentment towards black men. And black women believe, if I am going to rear this young black boy to not be like the black men I've encountered in life, I have to allow them to feel some of the pain that black men have previously caused me. And that does nothing but make them a wounded, misogynistic, and abusive black man. And so we can sit here and talk about the problem all day, but I think one of the solutions that we need to do in order to beat this dilemma, in order to beat these statistics that Dr. Patton is talking about, and this is not her opinion. She says, I looked at the statistics. In order to beat this, we have to start finding ways to help young black girls and young black women heal from the trauma that has been caused to them by young black or older black men. We have to begin to heal and partner with them in their wounds of molestation, in their wounds of rape, their wounds of seeing their mothers beaten and abused, their wounds of seeing their mothers cheated on, their wounds of seeing that their mother or themselves were good enough to lay down with, but men got up and flee when responsibility comes on the table. Their wounds to say that many black men will lay down with a woman because they like how she looks, but they do not understand or love any part about her. We have to begin to look at those situations. We have to begin to find healing for our young black sisters and our black women, and we have to have healed black girls and black women before they give birth to black boys. If we do not have healed young black girls and black women before they give birth to black boys, the black boy either ends up playing the position where the black male is void in their life, or they end up getting abused for the position where the black male is void in their life. And I think that instead of just hearing this from a black woman, it may help to hear this from a black man who was once a black boy. I read a very interesting memoir by the name of Heavy. It's by a gentleman by the name of Kiese Layman. And in this book, he talks a great deal about the confusion that he was a victim of in his childhood because of the abusive / love relationship that his mother had with him. I want to take you to a quote, a part of this book where he talks about this relationship with his mother. I'm going to start reading about right here. And he says, as a child on nights when you and I didn't sleep together, I remember trembling, imagining a life where I wasn't yours. I remember you chiding me not to use contractions when talking to white people and police. I remember believing all your lies were mistakes and forgetting those mistakes when we woke up tucked into each other. Every time you said my particular kind of hard-headedness and white Mississippians' brutal desire for black suffering were recipes for an early death, institutionalization, or incarceration, I knew you were right. I just didn't care. I cared about the way you grit your teeth when you beat me for not being perfect. I cared about girls at school seeing my welts. I cared about you. Days and often hours before you beat me, you touched me so gently. You told me you loved me. You called me your best friend. You forgave me for losing the key to the house. You coated the ashy cracks in my face with Vaseline slick palms. You used your nubby thumbs, wet with saliva, to clean the sleep out of my eyes. You made me feel like the most beautiful black boy in the history of Mississippi until you didn't. I didn't try to hurt you, you told me the last time we spoke. I don't remember hurting you as much as you remember being hurt, Key. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm just saying I don't remember everything the way you do. And he says to his mother after she says that, I still believe you. But that right there in itself shows us the effects that a black male has in his psychology from growing up in the space and the environment of a black woman that has the responsibility of raising him, but has not healed from her trauma with the black male species. And a part of her loving him is also her taking out the resentment and the abuse for which she's been through in her life. So I love you to carry this conversation on. Are black women and maternal violence the reason for misogynistic and abusive and wounded black men? Let's talk about it. Thank you for watching this episode of Reexamining the Right.